Hey guys, so for this video I surveyed players in the Infernoble Duelist Facebook group and just to gather their thoughts in terms of what they think are the key strengths of this deck, as well as some of the best hand traps as well as staples that they respect the most as they pilot this strategy. So as whether you play Infernoble or not, I think this video will be helpful in terms of giving you a good oversight of this deck as well as what it can do. And of course, a very big thanks to all of you that responded. 30 players responded to this survey. Really appreciate it, and it couldn't have been done without you guys. And of course, before we continue, big thanks to my sponsors as usual, links and discount codes down below. Now, in terms of the pilots, or rather the player's ability to pilot this deck, most kind of said that they're pretty strong in terms of being able to pilot Infernoble, so just things to keep in mind as you kind of interpret the answers to this survey. Now, in terms of how difficult this deck is to pilot, the players actually gave it around a 7.7 average score, and so this is actually the exact same score that I saw with the Pearly players when I did the survey with them very recently, as well as also Vanadium that was around 7.3 for context that you can certainly check out in my other videos. So anyways, of course, any kind of combo wombo oriented strategy is usually not the easiest to pilot because there's so many different combo lines, especially a deck like Infernoble. There's a lot of different variety of combination of cards, and you can do a lot of different combo paths. So I think it's pretty fair and certainly not the easiest deck to pilot. So some things to keep in mind if you were considering picking this deck up, but of course really depends on your comfort level. So in terms of what tier the players will put this, actually a lot of them put it at tier 2, about 3/4 of them actually. I think some put in Rogue, even some put it in tier 1. Is it tier 1? I'm not too sure at this point. It certainly has, it's a very strong deck, but I think tier 2 is pretty fair. I think even some might put it at the top of Rogue. I think we do need some more regional level events to sort of, happen for us to be able to actually properly assess it, because right now we haven't had that many events. Now, in terms of the key strengths that the players felt with Infernoble is the hand knowledge was the most number one mentioned comment in the survey, and especially because the Aqua Dolphin summon and the rip, just to not only get to see your opponent's hand but also be able to rip a card. Let's say for example a hand trap, ideally maybe sometimes an engine piece if the attack is low enough, and so that's always nice. Not only that, it actually does burn damage too, so in time that can also come up, unfortunately. So I think that's very fair. Being able to know what your opponent has in their hand, it's just super valuable. There's a reason why cards like, let's say, a Point of the Red Lotus got banned, as well as of course like Trap Does Shoot. And so what's particularly useful too is against, let's say, Super Poly has become quite popular right now, and so that's something we can kind of touch on regarding Infernoble. But if you know that your opponent has Super Poly now because you were able to see their hand, you can sort of actually build your end board accordingly so that you don't just hard lose to it. Now, another common theme in the survey was, the strengths was that the consistency of the deck, as well as ability to push through many interruptions, particularly hand traps, for example, when it's going first. Of course, there are some exceptions. Let's say Shifter, which we'll get to later, clearly is something that will just straight up shut this deck down. Another mention in the survey is it has a good grind game and just pretty good recovery, even if the board is clear, which of course, something like Dark Ruler can be quite devastating, although it kind of depends on your build, and so at least it has a good clapback game. And then lastly, another thing that was mentioned by multiple players was just gear feed, Immortal gear feed. So essentially, not only is a searchable board breaker going second, but also can serve as a monster negate just to protect yourself from something like Nibiru, which can really clear boards otherwise. Now, in terms of the typical end board for Infernoble, and keep in mind the keyword is typical, not ideal, okay? So it's not like when you have like a God Hand and have like 10 plus interruptions. So first, we're going to start off with the 1 to 2 Charles the Great links. So essentially, each of them will serve as spell trap negations. And on top of that, of course, even if you do have both, it will just be one pop. But essentially, it is actually untargetable pop. So that can definitely be relevant. And actually, if speaking of untargetable, Charles, that itself will you probably won't be able to target it because it will likely be equipped with Oliver, so it has that protection as well. And then on top of this, you have something like let's say Immortal Phoenix Gear Feed that I mentioned earlier, which can serve as that monster negate, or maybe both. You can also have a Barone on top of that, which serves as an Omni negate. So those are things to keep in mind. Obviously, not always you're going to have all of these cards, but at the very least, you should be mindful of what kind of board that they can set up. Now, of course, there are some potential other add-ons. Let's say going first when they side, they can have such as the new cards from the Battle Boxers that allows them to access Flamvel counter just to be able to actually stop Dark Ruler no more. I understand that not every Infernoble list are going to be playing that package, but just keep in mind they do technically have another way to try to stop Dark Ruler. And then Ratin or Ratten, honestly guys, I've never seen this card in my life, but apparently this is another card that they can end on. It essentially serves as a pop in battle phase. And then finally, while probably not the most common thing to end on, but I did want to highlight it, is that this deck can make Baguska, which can be, you know, just a really strong floodgate against a deck like, let's say, Branded. And so, you know, just things to keep in mind, whether you were thinking of picking this deck up or whether you're going up against Infernoble, you know, being able to make being able to make Baguska is always nice for any deck. So now in terms of the hand traps that the Infernoble players said they respect the most as they pilot this strategy, and one way to look at it is cards that can be good to side against Infernoble, or if you play Infernoble yourself, you know, this is a good way to see what your fellow pilots think in terms of, you know, what cards have the most impact against Infernoble. And so of course, Shifter was the #1 mention. Of course, you know, unfortunately you cannot actually really play around Shifter. If they have it, they just have it. So that's why hopefully the card just gets banned or gets hit in some fashion. In the next list, it's just too toxic of a card. Anyways, you know, it is unfortunately just a very devastating card for Infernoble. As for Droll, this was mentioned a lot as well. It's kind of interesting though, because they're definitely, if you read like the comments in the survey, you know, they were actually saying that if they can kind of play through Droll, perhaps, you know, in some hands you can. And of course, if you have Aqua Dolphin play available and you can just rip that Droll out, which is very nice. But if not, you know, of course, I don't think you can really deny the impact that Droll has on this deck. You know, a lot of their cards like search one another and just a lot of searching going on. So definitely can be pretty good. Imperm or Veiler, monster negations can be pretty strong for any deck that plays Isolde realistically. Of course, usually, you know, you're kind of taught to negate that second effect of Isolde, and some of you might think, why not just negate right from the get-go and just negate both effects essentially through an Imperm. And the reason for that is because, you know, that first add effect on the summon, they can't use that card that turn anyways, and you know, if you Imperm right from the beginning, if they can go into a second Isolde, which they most likely always play, they can always use that the summon effect from the deck, which is what's actually important. So that's kind of like what you end up wanting to negate and just let them have that add, for example. Nibiru can of course can be deadly if paired with another hand trap, but you know, they can also be able to bring out that gear feed by the 5th summon, just so they have that monster negate for that protection we've already talked about. So things to keep in mind. DD Crow was also actually mentioned as something to target that Charles, I guess, when they're trying to bring it back. So it's, you know, something to consider. Ash, Ogre, Bell, Lancia, I guess they're kind of low impact. Lancia was kind of mentioned actually, just because it would actually prevent something like that Phoenix Blade from coming back. But realistically, you know, almost no one's playing Lancia at the moment, so that's probably why it didn't really score that low, because it's just not too relevant in the current meta right now. And of course, Best Shields just for the most part just completely useless. They're all fire for the most part. Now, in terms of the best board breakers that the Infernoble players say that they respect the most as they pilot the deck, Dark Ruler, of course, was scored #1. Certainly by far, you know, it is a very monster-heavy end board, so it can really be susceptible to Dark Ruler. But as I mentioned earlier, you can technically play that Flamvel counter card through the Battle Boxer package that, you know, technically most, or rather, not all players are running. They also did mention that the post Age of Overlord, you're going to get that Angel Ring Equip spell, which essentially negates like the first spell effect by the opponent. So, you know, you can always like negate the activation of your opponent's spells, for example, and then once they play Dark Ruler, then the Equip spell itself will just take care of that. So that's always nice to have. So Infernoble players have something to look forward to soon. Next, in terms of Super Poly, can also be quite strong because they are Fire Warriors, so you could make something like Garura, but as I mentioned earlier, they can technically, especially if they know that you have Super Poly because of that Aqua Dolphin line, they can play around it, just because I've seen players where they would actually just end on like 2 Charles, as well as, you know, just pop their own Angelica, just so that they can't get Super Poly for Garura, because you can't just Super Poly 2 exact same name monsters. Also, any like Lava Golem, Sphere Mode, Kirkar, like those kind of Kaiju-like cards clearly has a common theme here in terms of it being very, very good against their strategy. And really, the top cards that you see here essentially reflect cards that, you know, you just cannot really respond with like monster effects, right? That's where it's really, really strong. So again, until that Age of Overlord set comes out with Angel Ring, I think for now there's a lot of board breakers that's going to be very, very good against Infernoble. Next, in terms of the Floodgates that Infernoble players also respect, unfortunately, it seems like Floodgates are quite strong against them. So, for example, there can be only one. They're the same type. They're all warriors, so that's going to be very, very strong. Even anti-spell, they play a lot of spells. Actually, some players, though, mentioned in the survey that they can surprisingly kind of play through it sometimes. But of course, I'm sure it's dependent. Any combo deck is going to just struggle against Summon Limit. There's no surprise there. It's not unique to Infernoble. Zombie World's also an interesting one, just because it's something, you know, if Branded still sees a decent amount of play, let's say tier 2 level, you know, they can easily tutor out Zombie World through the Banshee line that they can dump off Branded Fusion. And Zombie World changing everything to zombies, you know, they do require at least warriors to get into that Izzle play. Technically Angelica as well as the Synchro Charles, they are actually more generic in terms of material requirements, but still Zombie World can be pretty strong, at least if you know, you're going first and playing Zombie World. Skill Drain, again, just combo decks in general. Skill Drain is probably going to be very effective. They did note how, you know, certain cards like, let's say, the Goki Link 4 that can kind of get rid of Skill Drain, as well as even Access Code Toker. You can always get rid of Access Toker itself to be able to pop the Skill Drain, but just going into those lines of play is quite a high commitment. So it is still pretty strong. D-Barrier was another one that they mentioned, just because it is a synchro-oriented strategy. They do have some link plays available, but in under D-Barrier, I guess they can kind of go like more gear-free control, as well as, you know, just more beatdown strategies. So at least kind of like run down from there. And finally, in terms of some of the key weaknesses that Infernoble players feel about this deck is that that they think that the deck is kind of easy to side against, you know, Dark Ruler and just a lot of other board breakers can be quite detrimental against this strategy. Again, as I mentioned, you know, there's something to look forward to, at least with Age of Overload and that Angel Ring that's going to come out. They also mentioned how the deck can be quite weak to a lot of different floodgates and just struggling against back row. We just talked about this in terms of, you know, there can be only one. There's also, you know, like Summon Limit or even Zombie World that can be very good, and it's just obviously floodgates are not the best, or rather not the most fun to play against, and unfortunately we are experiencing a lot of those right now, especially something like D-Barrier, where you just for the most part cannot even really stop for the whole turn. And then they also mentioned about how the deck requires a lot of engine space, and anytime you have a deck like that where you just cannot fit a lot of, let's say, a lot of hand traps, board breakers, or at least not as many as some of the key meta decks can, at least, it can also be kind of hard to break boards, especially going second without a lot of non-engine spaces. And lastly, you know, the players did mention that because this deck does require quite a lot of equipped spells to be able to play this deck, and, you know, they can all serve as potential bricks, especially when you don't actually have monsters to equip it to, right? So of course, you know, bricking is not anything exclusive to Infernoble. At least the players actually did mention this deck is quite consistent, but just some things to keep in mind in terms of, you know, the type of bricks that you do have to play to pilot Infernoble. So anyways, that was it for the survey overview of the Infernoble players and what they think about the deck. Hopefully you found that interesting. Again, you can check a similar video with the Manadium as well as Pearly players that I did very recently. I'm also going to do it with Unchained as well as Rescue Ace very shortly, so stay tuned for those. So a big thanks to all of you for watching. A huge thanks to my patrons as always for supporting the channel as always, and well, take care guys.